Absolutely. I think the 50s are a critical era. I think in my book, I think the title of that chapter is called The Cauldron, because it's this moment where anti-communism now has purchased across all of American society. Even presidents like Truman and Eisenhower are bent on, declare themselves anti-communists. Truman implements loyalty programs. And so as a result, this emboldens and it legitimizes a lot of the things that the far right have been saying. They've been saying that the government's been full of communists for 20 years at this point, and now they can say, see, we told you. Not to mention, Joseph McCarthy and all of his witch hunting and all this stuff. And so absolutely. And what's interesting is that in the modern day, the Birch Society has gotten a lot of attention, rightfully so. They still exist. But what I think is interesting is that the Birch Society, to me, wasn't the beginning of the far-right movement or even the beginning of, the modern conservative movement, but more so kind of a culmination of a moment, because the far-right had been building since the New Deal era. And then in 1958, when the Birch Society is created, it's this moment where Robert Welch, the founder, decides, well, the far-right has been so disconnected for so long, we need to have a central kind of clearinghouse organization. And that's what the Birch Society became. Was this big organization, boasting at least 100,000 members, maybe more. They never released their membership rolls, so we don't really know how many people there were. But the important thing about the Birchers is that not only do they provide kind of a central meeting ground, like a point of convergence, but also they just do things. Right. William Buckley isn't out there knocking on doors and getting people to sign signature drives. Right. He's writing op-eds in National Review, whereas Birchers are going out there and knocking on doors, asking people to sign signature drives, registering voters. Those are the people who are spearheading this conservative movement. And that's, to me, why the far right is so important.
In their ground game, and in the fact that, as you mentioned, at this point, it's just anti-communism is ubiquitous. And that, would you say that that's an indication of maybe a canary in the coal mine for early rhetorical wins by the conservatives? Because that's a consensus by this time period.
Absolutely. And I think you guys would probably agree that I would argue that conservatives for a long time have been better at messaging than liberals or leftists or Democrats or whomever. They're just so good at winning those rhetorical battles. And I think anti-communism was one of those moments. Now, in fairness, they did get kind of like a leg up, because with the Soviet Union and the post-World War II era making communism kind of this focal point, it really legitimized and kind of fueled the far right's rhetoric. And like I said, it made them seem like they were telling the truth, or at the very least that there was something there. And of course, we haven't even really touched on it, but a lot of this anti-communism, though, does lead to conspiracy thinking. That there's this big bad enemy that's kind of pulling all the strings.
Well, John Birch was instrumental in mainstreaming that as well.
Absolutely. Robert Welch, wrote a book throughout the 1950s, and finally he started sending it to people like William Buckley and others. And in his book, it's called The Politician, he basically accuses Eisenhower of being a communist, like the D-Day guy. You know what I mean? Like, he's like, oh, Eisenhower's a communist. And it's just this ridiculous characterization, but he stacks the facts just right to where if you squint at it, you're like, oh, maybe,
Right. And you mentioned Buckley. That's probably important to start talking about his influence, right? I did another interview maybe a year ago. God, all of this blends in my mind, frankly. But Buckley later kind of tried to distance himself from John Birch, but he was, I think, talking out of both sides of his mouth to that degree, because it's another example of this desire, this impulse to say there's a distinction between the crazies and the Mitt Romneys or whatever. But frankly, it's a symbiotic relationship, and Buckley was very much involved, or at least, kind of working alongside the Birchers and the crazies. What did you in your research find in terms of that relationship? And is my characterization accurate, frankly?
No, I do think your characterization is accurate. And I think this is one of the key areas in which historians have not done a great job of telling the history of the conservative movement, because historians often focused on guys like Buckley. And of course, Buckley wanted to draw those lines of respectability and would say, oh, no, we're not like those guys. And historians picked up on that and then wrote these books about this respectable conservative movement, and that there were these rigid definitions, and that the crazies and the kooks were over here, and these guys are legitimate. But the problem is that that's not reality. There was a lot of overlap, and continues to be a lot of overlap. The conservative movement is a big tent, and all the boundaries that might exist, all the words that we use to describe various types of conservatives, those boundaries are very porous. Just to give you an example, in the 1950s, when Robert Welch was writing his book, he corresponded with Berkeley. The guy Roger Millikan, one of the key funders of National Review, Buckley's magazine, Roger Millikan was a Birch Society member. Robert Welch donated $2,000 to National Review to help get it off the ground in the early 50s. And in fact, the very views that Buckley had aren't all that dissimilar from what the far right was saying. Very infamously, in 1957, Buckley wrote an article in National Review talking about race in the South, and argued that the white race he called white people the advanced race. Those were his exact words, and said that as a result, they have a right to rule. And so it's like, how is that any different from what Southern segregationists are saying?
Right.
It's the exact same thing.
Well, that's a good opportunity to talk about, since we are in this time period, the civil rights era, and how this plays into this. Brown v. Board in the 50s. I'm forgetting exactly what year that was. Or no.
54. You're in.
54. Okay, good. I'm terrible with dates, honestly. But this is happening right at the same time period. So there's just like it was decades before, there's the Klan and the anti-communism elements, and there's the racism and the continued anti-communism elements. How was this time period of conservatism? It seems obvious, but maybe it's not. Developing itself in opposition to Black people and to civil rights.
Yeah, there's the various obvious opposition, right? The people who just don't want segregation to end. And in 1954, there's all sorts of pushback. There's the Southern Manifesto that gets written, I believe, in 1956 by a bunch of congressmen who all sign it and basically say that, the state is, has its boot on our neck, more or less. And of course, then you see guys running for Congress or for president, even George Wallace. But what I find so interesting about this moment is that there are rhetorical shifts that start happening in the 50s and 60s, because at a certain point, in some states you can still be an overt racist, but in a lot of states you can't anymore. And so at a certain point, conservatives sort of dial back the racism and shift to what they would call like what some scholars would call like dog whistle politics, or even like colorblind conservatism. This idea that they start talking about states' rights and other forms of other things that, if you kind of scratch at that surface, it's still the same old racism. It's still trying to keep Jim Crow around, but not with the blunt racism of the 30s and 40s per se. And again, that's generalizing, but I do think that was happening.